the man who slept in his car while building a billion-dollar company. There's a version of this story that gets told a lot online, dramatized, exaggerated, missing half the real details. So before we get into it, I want to tell you the actual story, the one that's genuinely documented, about a man named John Paul DeJoria, because the real version is honestly more interesting than any fictionalized one could be. This is a man who, at one point in his life, was sleeping in his own car, collecting empty soda bottles for spare change just to have enough money to eat that day. And decades later, he had built a company generating hundreds of millions of dollars a year, plus a stake in a tequila brand worth over $800 million. Not because of some lucky break, not because someone discovered him, but because of one specific decision he made when he had absolutely nothing left to lose. Let's actually get into how this happened. The start. Nothing close to easy. John Paul DeJoria's childhood wasn't the kind that set someone up for billionaire status. He grew up poor, and at a young age, things got hard enough that he ended up in foster care for a period. Later, as a teenager, he found himself involved with a gang. Not exactly the origin story you'd expect from someone who'd eventually build a business empire, but somewhere in there, DeJoria found a way out. He joined the military, which gave him structure and direction that his early life hadn't provided. When he came out, he didn't have money, he didn't have connections, and he didn't have a safety net. What he did have was a willingness to work, literally any job that would keep him afloat. He sold Christmas cards and newspapers as a kid just to bring money home to his family, selling things, talking to strangers, hustling for small amounts of money. This wasn't new to him. It had been his whole life, hitting the absolute bottom. Here's where the story gets to the part everyone remembers. Because it's the part that's almost unbelievable, and yet, it's real. At one particularly low point in his adult life, DeJoria was homeless. He was sleeping in his car, and to get enough money together just for basic food, he was going around collecting empty bottles and cans to return for cash. Think about that for a second. This is not a metaphorical rock bottom that gets thrown around loosely in motivational content. This is a man with no roof, no steady income, going door to door selling shampoo, just trying to survive one day to the next. There was no indication, at that moment, sitting in his car, that any of this was going to turn into anything. If you'd told him then that he'd eventually be worth billions of dollars, he probably wouldn't have believed you. He was just trying to make it to tomorrow. The decision that changed everything. While he was selling shampoo door to door just to get by, DeJoria met a hairdresser named Paul Mitchell. Between the two of them, in 1980, they had $700. $700 and an idea. They wanted to create their own line of hair care products. Something better than what was currently on the market. Something built by people who actually understood hair, not just corporate chemists trying to hit a price point. $700 is an almost absurd amount of money to start what would become a hugely successful global hair care brand. It's less than what some people spend on a single shopping trip. But DeJoria and Mitchell didn't have the luxury of waiting until they had enough money, because more money was never coming. They started anyway, selling door to door, going salon to salon, convincing one hairdresser at a time to give their products a chance. Loss, and continuing. Anyway, not long after their company, John Paul Mitchell Systems, started gaining real traction, Paul Mitchell was diagnosed with cancer and passed away. This is a detail that often gets left out of the quick motivational version of this story, but it matters. DeJoria didn't just build this company during a period of hardship. He had to keep building it after losing the very partner he built it with, at a moment when the business still needed just as much work and belief as it did on day one. He kept going. He took over the company fully, and it grew into one of the most recognized hair care brands in the world, the kind of products you'll still find in salons today, decades later. Betting on something completely different. Here's the part of DeJoria's story that shows this wasn't a one-time lucky break, because building one successful company from nothing is already rare. But he did it again. In 1989, years after John Paul Mitchell Systems was already thriving, DeJoria partnered with Martin Crowley to acquire a stake in a small tequila brand called Patron. At the time, tequila had a reputation problem. It was seen as a cheap party drink, not a premium spirit. DeJoria and Crowley bet against that perception, building Patron into a completely different category of tequila, something positioned as a luxury spirit, sipped rather than shot. That bet paid off. Patron eventually grew into a brand generating sales of more than $800 million. What actually made the difference? So here's the honest question worth sitting with. What actually separated DeJoria's rock-bottom moment, sleeping in a car and collecting bottles for cash, from the millions of other people who've hit genuine rock-bottom and never made it out? It wasn't intelligence alone. Plenty of brilliant people never get the chance to build anything. It wasn't luck alone either, though timing and circumstance always play some role. If you look closely at his actual path, a few things stand out. He never stopped being willing to sell, to talk to strangers, to knock on the next door even after the last 9 said no. He didn't wait for the right amount of money before starting. $700 was what he had, so $700 was what he used. And when tragedy hit, when his own business partner died right as things were taking off, he didn't use it as a reason to quit. He kept the company moving forward anyway. None of this means hard work alone guarantees this outcome. It clearly doesn't, or homelessness wouldn't exist at the scale it does. But it does mean that DeJoria's story isn't really about a magic idea or an overnight miracle. It's about someone who kept making the next small move, door after door, product after product, even when there was no evidence yet that any of it was going to work. The uncomfortable truth in this story. What makes this story genuinely worth telling, instead of just another sanitized rags to riches clip, is that it doesn't skip the hard parts. It doesn't skip the gang involvement as a teenager. It doesn't skip literally sleeping in a car. It doesn't skip losing his business partner right when things were finally working. The real version of this story has actual loss and actual desperation in it, not just a highlight reel edited to look inspiring. And maybe that's exactly why it's worth remembering. Because the sanitized version, he started a company and got rich, doesn't teach you anything. But knowing that a man who was homeless, collecting bottles for grocery money, kept knocking on doors with a bag of shampoo samples anyway, that's a very different kind of story. It's not really about the money he eventually made. It's about what he kept doing during the years when there was no money at all. Conclusion. So the next time your own situation feels like it's nowhere close to where you want it to be, remember that somewhere in the middle of DeJoria's story, there was a man in a car with no idea any of this was coming. No signs, no certainty, just the next door to knock on. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. And if you'd like more real verified stories like this one instead of the exaggerated versions that get passed around online, hit like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.